The most famous gunfight in the history of the American West lasted less than a minute. 30 seconds of gunfire in a narrow lot in Tombstone, Arizona, turned Wyatt Earp into one of the most recognizable figures of the frontier. But the story most people know about that gunfight is not entirely accurate, because the real events that took place in Tombstone on October 26, 1881, were far more complicated than the legend that followed. That afternoon, 8 men stood facing each other in a narrow space beside Fremont Street. On one side were the Earp brothers and their associate, Doc Holliday. On the other were several members of a loose outlaw group known locally as the Cowboys. Within half a minute, roughly 30 shots were fired. 3 men were killed, 3 others were wounded. Wyatt Earp was the only participant who walked away uninjured. The confrontation later became known as the gunfight at the OK Corral, although the shooting itself actually took place about 60 feet away in a small lot beside the photography studio of C.S. Fly. The event was brief, violent, and immediately controversial. Supporters of the Earps argued that they were enforcing Tombstone's firearms ordinance against armed men who had been making threats throughout the day. Supporters of the Cowboys claimed the men had been surrendering when the shooting began. A local court examined the evidence and ruled that the Earps had acted within their authority as lawmen. Public opinion, however, remained sharply divided. In the years that followed, the confrontation became one of the most widely retold episodes of the American frontier. Books, films, and television programs later portrayed Wyatt Earp as a central figure in the struggle to impose law and order in the West. The historical record presents a more complex picture. The gunfight itself lasted roughly 30 seconds. The arguments about what happened there have continued for more than a century, and the town where it occurred was never supposed to exist in the first place. At various times, as many as 5 Earp brothers lived in or around Tombstone. The most prominent was Wyatt Earp. He was 31 years old when he arrived, broad-shouldered and known for his heavy mustache. People who encountered him often remarked on his stillness. He rarely raised his voice, and his composure tended to make other men uneasy. Before coming to Arizona, he had worked as a lawman in Wichita and Dodge City. In those cities, he developed a reputation for enforcing local firearms ordinances firmly but not excessively. Rather than immediately resorting to gunfire, he often disarmed offenders and struck them with the butt of a revolver, a practice commonly described as pistol whipping. By the standards of the frontier, he was not considered unusually violent. His reputation rested more on patience and control. Despite later legend, Wyatt Earp did not hold the office of town marshal in Tombstone. That position belonged to his older brother, Virgil Earp. Virgil was appointed acting town marshal during the summer of 1881 and had previous combat experience from the Civil War. Wyatt held a more ambiguous role. He was occasionally deputized and could exercise authority when acting alongside his brother, but he was also involved in several private ventures. He held interests in a saloon, partial ownership of a mining claim, and employment as a security guard for Wells Fargo stagecoaches. Men with similar occupations were commonly described at the time as sporting men, a term used for individuals who moved between legitimate business and gambling or entertainment enterprises. Wyatt Earp also pursued political advancement. He ran for the office of Cochise County Sheriff against a local figure named Johnny Behan. During the campaign, Behan persuaded Wyatt to withdraw from the race, reportedly promising that he would appoint him undersheriff if elected. After winning the election, Behan instead chose another man for the position. Wyatt Earp regarded the decision as a betrayal.
Tombstone's political environment soon divided into two camps. The Earps were generally aligned with the town's Republican business leadership, including the mayor and the editor of the Tombstone Epitaph. Their primary rivals were a group widely known in the region as the Cowboys.
In southern Arizona, during the early 1880s, the term cowboy often carried a negative meaning. Legitimate cattle workers were usually called ranchers or herders. The cowboys referred to a loose network of men based in ranching districts outside Tombstone who supplemented their income through cattle rustling and occasional stagecoach robberies. The group had no formal membership list, but likely included several dozen men. Many of them were politically aligned with Sheriff Johnny Behan and the Democratic faction in local politics. Two families formed the core of the group's presence in Tombstone: the Clantons and the McClorys. Ike Clanton, 34 years old, was known for speaking loudly about his grievances but rarely participating in actual gunfights. His younger brother, Billy Clanton, was 19. Frank and Tom McClory operated a ranch and were suspected by some residents of trafficking in stolen Mexican cattle. Although none of these men were considered the most dangerous outlaws in the territory, they were visible figures in Tombstone's daily life and frequently clashed with the Earp brothers. Tensions increased throughout 1881. The Earps attempted to enforce a town ordinance that required visitors entering Tombstone to surrender their firearms while inside city limits. Several cowboys were disarmed and publicly humiliated during these encounters. Some were struck with revolvers during arrests. Members of the cowboy faction responded with threats, often made while drinking in local saloons. They spoke openly about possible confrontations with the Earp brothers. Personal conflicts further complicated the situation. Sheriff Johnny Behan had recently ended a relationship with a woman named Josephine Marcus, who soon afterward became involved with Wyatt Earp. By the autumn of 1881, political disputes, personal rivalries, and repeated confrontations over weapons had merged into a single escalating conflict. On October 25, 1881, Ike Clanton rode into Tombstone. He had been drinking during the trip and continued drinking after arriving in town. Throughout the evening, he moved between several saloons and repeatedly stated that he intended to kill the Earp brothers. Witnesses later reported hearing these statements in multiple establishments. The threats continued into the early hours of the following morning. At one point, Doc Holliday, a close associate of Wyatt Earp, confronted Clanton. Holliday had trained as a dentist in Georgia, but later supported himself through gambling. He also suffered from tuberculosis. The argument between the two men escalated into a loud public dispute. By sunrise, Ike Clanton had not slept. He remained armed and highly agitated. Around 8 o'clock in the morning, Virgil Earp located him in town carrying both a rifle and a revolver. Because Tombstone's ordinance prohibited firearms inside city limits, Virgil disarmed him by force, striking him with a pistol and escorting him to the courthouse. Clanton was charged with carrying weapons within town limits and fined $25. As he was taken through the streets, he continued making threats against the Earps. Later that morning, Tom McClory arrived in Tombstone. Wyatt Earp encountered him on the street and struck him with a revolver as well. The exact reason for this encounter was disputed even at the time. By midday, Frank McClory and Billy Clanton had also entered town. 5 cowboys were now present in Tombstone, and several citizens began reporting their movements to Virgil Earp. Witnesses stated that the group had visited a gun shop on 4th Street and filled their cartridge belts. Others reported hearing them discuss killing the Earps. A railroad engineer named H.F. Sills, who had arrived in town only the previous day, later testified that he overheard members of the group say they intended to kill the Earps when they encountered them. Virgil Earp responded by deputizing Wyatt and their younger brother Morgan. He also asked Doc Holliday to accompany them and provided him with a shotgun concealed beneath a long coat. The 4 men then began walking west along Fremont Street toward a narrow lot beside C.S. Fly's photography studio. Sheriff Johnny Behan attempted to intercept them along the way. He told Virgil that he had already spoken to the cowboys and that they had agreed to surrender their weapons. Virgil continued forward.
The lot beside the studio was about 15 feet wide. As the Earps and Holliday entered the lot, Virgil Earp held Doc Holliday's walking cane in his right hand in order to appear unarmed. A revolver remained in his belt. He called out to the cowboys and ordered them to raise their hands and surrender their weapons. No one raised their hands. The precise sequence of events that followed has been debated since the day it occurred. The most widely accepted reconstruction suggests that someone among the cowboys began reaching for a weapon. Doc Holliday fired the shotgun at Tom McClory from close range. Virgil Earp drew his revolver and shot Billy Clanton. Wyatt Earp fired at Frank McClory and struck him in the stomach. The exchange of gunfire quickly became chaotic. Frank McClory moved into the street while firing his revolver despite his wound. Billy Clanton, also wounded, slid down against a wall but continued shooting. Morgan Earp was struck by a bullet but passed through both shoulder blades. Virgil Earp was hit in the calf. Doc Holliday received a grazing wound to the hip. Ike Clanton approached Wyatt Earp while unarmed and stated that he was not fighting. Wyatt pushed him aside and told him either to fight or leave. Clanton ran from the scene. Another cowboy present, Billy Claiborne, had already fled. Frank McClory continued firing in the street while exchanging shots with Doc Holliday. He was struck again and fell. Billy Clanton attempted to cock his revolver while lying on the ground, but was unable to continue. He died shortly afterward. Tom McClory had already died from the shotgun wound. The entire exchange lasted approximately 30 seconds. The following day, the tombstone epitaph printed the headline, "3 men hurled into eternity in the duration of a moment." Wyatt Earp emerged from the encounter without injury. Funerals for the McClory brothers and Billy Clanton drew large crowds. Approximately 300 people followed the procession to the cemetery, and nearly 2,000 residents watched along the route. Before the burial, the coffins were displayed in a shop window on Allen Street beneath a sign reading, "Murdered in the Streets of Tombstone." 4 days after the shooting, Ike Clanton filed murder charges against Wyatt Earp, Virgil Earp, Morgan Earp, and Doc Holliday. A preliminary hearing began before Justice of the Peace Wells Spicer and continued for 30 days. Testimony presented sharply conflicting accounts of the confrontation. Sheriff Johnny Behan and several witnesses stated that the cowboys had been surrendering when the shooting began. Supporters of the cowboy faction argued that the men had raised their hands and were shot anyway. The Earps and their allies maintained that the cowboys had threatened them throughout the day and had drawn weapons when ordered to surrender. After hearing the testimony, Justice Spicer ruled that the Earps had acted within their authority as lawmen and that the use of force was justified under the circumstances. The charges were dismissed. Despite the legal decision, divisions within the town remained unresolved. On the night of December 28, 1881, approximately 2 months after the gunfight, Virgil Earp was walking home from a card game at Schiefelin Hall when several men fired from a building under construction. Shotgun blasts struck his left arm. He survived, but the arm was permanently damaged. Wyatt Earp sent a telegram to United States Marshal Crawley Dake requesting federal authority to pursue those responsible. 2 months later, on March 18, 1882, Morgan Earp was playing pool at Campbell and Hatch's saloon while Wyatt stood nearby. Shots were fired through the rear door. One bullet struck Morgan in the back and fatally wounded him. Wyatt Earp organized a small group of deputies, including Doc Holliday, and began pursuing men believed to be involved in the attacks. During the following weeks, several suspected participants were killed. Frank Stillwell was shot near the Tucson train depot. Florentino Cruz was killed in the Dragoon Mountains. Curly Bill Brocious died during a confrontation at Iron Springs. Sheriff Johnny Behan attempted to arrest Wyatt Earp for murder, but he was unable to capture him. By April 1882, Wyatt Earp and several associates left Arizona Territory. He later lived in Colorado and other western states before eventually settling in Los Angeles. For many years after the events in Tombstone, Wyatt Earp remained relatively unknown outside the region. He worked in various occupations, including operating saloons, prospecting for minerals, and refereeing boxing matches. One boxing match in San Francisco in 1896 led to accusations that he had fixed the outcome. Later in life, he lived in Los Angeles with Josephine Marcus. During this period, he occasionally visited early Hollywood film sets and described frontier experiences to actors and producers. In 1927, a writer named Stuart Lake contacted him about producing an authorized biography. Wyatt Earp was 79 years old at the time. They met several times to discuss his life. Earp died on January 13, 1929, before the manuscript was completed. Lake published Wyatt Earp, Frontier Marshal, in 1931. The book presented a heroic portrayal of Earp and included quotations and episodes that historians later determined were exaggerated or invented. Among these was a revolver known as the Buntline Special, which earlier sources had never mentioned. Despite these issues, the book became widely popular and influenced later films and television programs about the American West.
The events of October 26, 1881, occurred in a narrow lot on Fremont Street, roughly 15 feet wide. During a brief exchange of gunfire, 3 men were killed and 3 others wounded. The physical facts of the shooting were recorded by witnesses and later examined during court proceedings. What remained uncertain was the interpretation of those events. Supporters of the Cowboys believed the men had been surrendering when they were shot. Supporters of the Earps maintained that the Cowboys drew weapons after being ordered to disarm. Justice Wells Spicer ruled that the Earps had acted lawfully. Public opinion in Tombstone remained divided. Over time, the confrontation became one of the most widely discussed incidents of the American frontier. Later books, films, and television programs portrayed Wyatt Earp as a central figure in the struggle to impose order on the Western territories. Wyatt Earp lived until 1929, long after the gunfight that made his name part of American history. The exchange of gunfire lasted less than a minute. Debate about what occurred there has continued for more than a century.